Welcome to the Madness and Grace podcast, where we explore the connection between mental health and faith. I'm Dr. Matthew Stanford, neuroscientist, author, and mental health advocate.
And I'm Dr. Madeline Stiers, therapist and trauma researcher. We're so glad you're joining us today. Each week, we have authentic conversations about personal stories, we share professional insights, and explore the meaningful ways faith can influence mental well-being.
Whether you're seeking comfort, understanding, or simply a new perspective, we're here to journey with you. Thanks for tuning in. Now let's dive into today's conversation. Hello once again, and welcome to the Madness and Grace podcast. We're thankful that you would join us today for another conversation about mental health and faith. And we have a conversation today that is a very common conversation that we have. It's something that people ask us about all the time, and that's about how do you know if you are struggling with depression, or a friend of yours is struggling with depression, or a loved one. And really, depression was kind of the thing that brought me to do what I do today, work at the Hope and Healing Center and in a mental health-oriented ministry, from some conversations I heard people having when I was actually an undergraduate about how, in their opinion, a true Christian could never have depression. And so that really made me start to think about these types of things. It kind of led me down this pathway over the years. So, Maddie, you have some opening thoughts on depression, some of the things you may have seen in the clinic here at the Hope and Healing Center?
Well, I think the first thing, when we're talking about depression, you and I and professionals in the field, we typically know that we are talking about like a clinical diagnosis, someone who meets the criteria for, someone who's experiencing a major depressive episode. And we're not talking about someone who is, for lack of better words, just sad, right? So depression, and the way we're going to talk about it today, is really, we're really discussing a significant deterioration of mental health in a way that presents in a certain way with certain criteria that you've met. And it really impacts your whole life and everything in every way. So, yeah.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. And, depression is way more than sadness. But we use that term very cheaply in our society today. People say, I'm depressed today, or just to mean that they're sad. So that's a good point. So why don't I actually just kind of give diagnostic criteria for depression, just so people can get an idea of kind of the depth of this mood disorder that we're talking about here. So this is from the diagnostics manual. And the individual is going to need to have 5 or more of these over at least a 2-week period. So there's a timing aspect of it. It has to be in place for at least 2 weeks or more. And you have to have 5 or more of these, which also gives you an idea that it can manifest somewhat different in individuals. And so the first one is a depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Markedly diminished interest or pleasure in activities that you used to find pleasurable. Fatigue or loss of energy, sleep disturbances, that's either you sleep too much or you don't sleep enough, significant weight or appetite changes. Again, that can be on either end. You can gain weight, you can lose weight, eat more, eat less. Feelings of worthlessness or guilt, difficulty thinking, concentrating, or making decisions, recurrent thoughts of death or suicide, and psychomotor agitation or retardation, meaning you're moving around too much or you're not moving around very much at all. And so you have to have at least 5 of those in place for a 2-week period or more. With that, the first 2 I mentioned, the depressed mood or the loss of interest, you have to have one of those and 4 others. And so you can see the kind of the depth there that we're talking about. We're talking about feelings of worthlessness. We're talking about physical symptoms. Really, as you said, the person really isn't functional as normal. And so we're talking about a pretty significant problem here. It is the leading cause of disability worldwide from data from the World Health Organization. And it's the second most common mental health concern in the United States, with anxiety disorders being number 1. But really, anxiety and depression often go hand in hand. Maybe you could give some thoughts on clinical treatment, or maybe an example that people maybe what it kind of looks like when a person starts to struggle with mental health or with depression.
So there's different ways that you can experience depression. You may have been diagnosed with major depressive disorder, and that's typically going to mean, receiving some sort of psychotherapeutic treatment, likely seeing a doctor or psychiatrist and getting on some antidepressants, medication to help manage it. maybe even mood stabilizers, things like that. And it's going to be chronic, persistent depression that you're trying to navigate and manage. And then there's also periods of depression, right? So like sometimes you'll have life situations will come up that are challenging or difficult. And so you'll, for more than 2 weeks, experience 5 or more of those symptoms that you just outlined. And you may take medication for a little bit, if you lose, loss of a child or extreme life circumstances may cause someone to have a period of depression. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have depression your entire life, right? So it's really important to take what that criteria that Matt just outlined and not self-diagnose, but go see a doctor if you're concerned, because there's just different ways that this presents itself, and it looks wildly different in the clinic with people. Experiencing depression can also be a symptom of another mental health disorder. So everything Matt just outlined is true. If the symptoms, you meet criteria for depression, if those symptoms are not attributable to another mental health diagnosis, such as schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or another medical issue. So it's important to also go get checked out by a primary care physician and have your physical stuff looked at, because, thyroid issues is a very common issue that can manifest and present like it's depression. But as soon as you get that addressed, the depression kind of fades away, right? So looking at depression, you can go through that criteria, which is in the DSM, and that's helpful, whatnot. But really, you can kind of think about it in some broader categories. It's emotional. It's going to impact you emotionally, like your mood. It's going to impact you cognitively, your ability to think. Physically, like Matt said, you may not be moving around as much. And then behaviorally, like what you're doing. Are you having thoughts of suicide? Is your weight and your food intake, are those behaviors changing? Things like that. So those are some broader categories to think about. And then, is it long-term, and is it negatively impacting other areas of your life, right? So is it impacting school? Is it impacting work? Is it impacting your relationship? Those are some of the questions that we ask when someone shows up into the office. Now Matt, I'm sure you've seen this too. There's a wide spectrum, I guess, of what depression can look like. And it can be situational. You lost your job, you're feeling depressed, need a little bit of a boost, some help with medication therapy, all the way to like serious major depressive disorder or depressive episode in bipolar disorder, in which those are so tangible. Like someone walks into your office, and first of all, it's taken them weeks to get there because they literally could not get out of bed, like immobilized, not able to move. And their husband or wife or spouse or family member had to like go to their house and drag them out of the house and put them in the car and bring them into the office. And you can just feel, I don't know how else to explain it, but you can just feel the depression in the room. Like it's so tangible. It's so heavy. And that's really hard. That's a really hard place to be and place
in the old
to
days,
sit
you
with
speak
someone.
about a reactive depression and endogenous depression.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody who had some event like you described, the death of a spouse, loss of a job, it kind of put them into a depressive episode versus a very kind of deep-seated, biologically driven, kind of something they may have inherited. I think something that's important for people to realize that at least I find this a lot of times when because most people just don't understand mental health problems generally, because why would they necessarily, right? So when we're talking about depression, we're talking about depressive episodes. And so a person goes into a depressive episode, which is kind of what you've been describing, kind of the criteria that I gave. They have this depressive episode. They're not going to stay in that depressive episode for the rest of their life, probably.
Right.
And so even there may even be some spontaneous recovery where they kind of come out of that. So a depressive episode can last weeks. It could last months. I'm sure it's not impossible for it to last years, although I've never personally seen that. But so a person could have depression, major depression, and not be diagnosed with depression, and have had it for quite some time. And when they go into a depressive episode at some point, then they finally, end up in front of someone who diagnoses them. And it's not like they just kind of caught that like a cold all of a sudden. They may have had depressive episodes in the past and they just kind of got through it, whatever that might look like.
White knuckle.
So I think there's a cyclical nature to depression. We oftentimes think of bipolar disorder as very cyclical. You're kind of up or you're down. Well, with depression, you're down or you're more normal. When you're down and you're more normal. And so, it is possible for a person to have a single depressive episode in a lifetime and never have another one. And I mean, I think that would be more reactive depression, perhaps. But it's possible for someone to have depressive episodes almost on a seasonal kind of like every winter, the person has a depressive episode, or every holiday or every anniversary of some event. I mean, so you can even look for triggers and kind of a time frame for them. So, but it isn't, I think one of the things that I think confuses a lot of people is this idea that, well, you just become depressed and then you're just kind of depressed forever after that. And the reality is that you could go into a depressive episode, perhaps not a clinically meaningful depressive episode, but maybe not the deepest depressive episode that's ever existed. And then after a period of time, you could kind of come out of it. What I'm not saying is if you're depressed, don't go get treatment. We'll talk about that in just a minute. What I'm saying is I meet a lot of people that are in their 30s that are now in a pretty serious depressive episode. And when you ask them about it, and you kind of go back, kind of do a retrospective kind of history, they'll describe what were depressive periods in their life in the past. They just never recognize it as depression. Oh, I'm just that kind of person, or that's just my personality, or things were really tough back then, or, things like that. And so they just never really recognized early on that they were having a depressive episode. So I think that's something that's important.
Yeah, I think the other thing to note about depression is depression and anxiety oftentimes kind of sit hand in hand. We call it, I think in school, I heard someone, maybe an old professor of mine, say depression and anxiety are like the wicked stepsisters, that if with one comes the other, and that's oftentimes.
Very bright person that said that.
I wonder who that could have been. For those of you who don't know out there, Matt was a professor of mine in undergrad, and fortunately, we've gotten to work together the last 10, 15 years. So yes, so depression, it's interesting because I think about, I had a period of depression in high school, and my parents and I still talk about it. I'd come home and I was usually like a bubbly, happy person, and I'd come home and I'd just sit down and be so like sad. And because my parents talked to me, they had good communication with me, and they would say, "What's wrong?" And I'd say, "I don't know. I'm just so sad. And I kept saying, "I don't know. I'm just so sad." And I couldn't. My mom would go, "Are you getting bullied? Like, are people picking on you? Like, what's happening? How are your grades? Like, how are your friends?" And I couldn't attribute it to anything. I just kept saying, "I don't know. I don't know." And finally, they figured it out. I mean, oh, maybe this is some mental health stuff, and got me some care and, feeling better. And so it's all of these symptoms, they could be attributed to something like we talked about, situational, or it could really just be that life, things come up and now you start to feel this way and you can't really place why. I think the other thing to think about when we're talking about depression, and we see this a lot in the clinic here, is how this affects you spiritually or religiously. You have this change in mood and feeling worthless. And so oftentimes that kind of translates in a religious or spiritual way into a loss of meaning or purpose spiritually. So feeling like life has no purpose, really questioning your path or your spiritual journey that God's called you on, having a sense of spiritual emptiness or disconnection with your higher power. You may start to feel like you've been abandoned by God, really questioning, like, if I'm feeling this terrible, why is God letting this happen to me? What's going on? Because one of the symptoms is becoming disinterested in things that you used to find interesting. You may not be going to church on Sundays. You may not be engaging in your community or doing any of those activities that you used to really enjoy. Along with the feelings of worthlessness, we also see guilt and shame just kind of associated with the depression start to pop up. So you might start to feel that you are not doing enough, or you're not strong enough of a believer. Like I said, isolating yourself from the community because you don't feel good enough. You don't feel like a good enough Christian or whatever that may be. And then that hopelessness that we kind of see in depression kind of taking a hopelessness into your religious or spiritual views. So you may start, maybe you're not reading scripture isn't providing hope. You're seeing the negative and kind of pulling into that and finding less hope in reading scripture. So it not only is the criteria that we've outlined already, it really can impact your religious or spiritual beliefs in a way that can be pretty profound. And that's what we see here in the clinic, is we have people coming in wanting to talk about their religious beliefs, and oftentimes they have a lot of questions because all of this may lead to some anger. They may be feeling upset with God, like, why is this happening? Why is my mental health struggling? Questioning what's going on. And yeah, it's interesting to see, because people want to talk about their religious beliefs in session, and we oftentimes get to do that with people who are depressed because it becomes such an important part of their treatment process.
No, absolutely. Depression distorts perceptions, and that's going to include your perceptions of God. I think all those things you outlined are spot on. I think one of the problems is that people, they see those things as more important than kind of just daily things that go on. So reading scripture, praying, how close you feel to God. So when they feel those, being altered because of depression, they start to think, well, maybe that's the cause of this. These are
Right.
important things. And, and I think we have to keep reminding ourselves that, for instance, God's presence it's not based on our emotional state. God is present. And so, and he isn't driven off by your emotional state. But unfortunately, because of those changes that you've described there in a person's faith and spirituality, a lot of times you get an over-spiritualization with depression. You'll even get pastors just will say outright that depression is a sin, that it's wrong to be depressed, that it's sinful to be depressed, that a person just needs to pray more or try to get closer to God, and that will cause their depression to go away. That sounds good, I guess, but that's just not the reality of life, and it's not even the reality of Scripture. There are plenty of people in the Scriptures that struggle with what would be pretty profound depression, I think probably the most obvious of those is King David in the Old Testament, and I've done a lot of writing about that. If you'd like to see that, you can look at a book I wrote called Grace for the Afflicted. I talk about that in there in the depression chapter. But, David is an interesting figure because not only do we have just kind of historical narrative about him as king, we also have a lot of writings that have been attributed to him in the Psalms. And most of David's Psalms are Psalms of lament. So for instance, look at like Psalm 42:5, why are you downcast, O my soul? Some of these Psalms that he writes are really, really dark. But you can look all over the Scriptures and you find people that are struggling. Job, we know why Job is depressed. He's lost so much. He's in a horrible traumatic experience. But, in Job 7:16, I loathe my life, my days have no meaning. I've heard that here in the clinic. That's a very modern Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane is tremendously depressed about what is about to occur to him. And, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. That's Matthew 26:38. Obviously, Jesus is very distressed at that point. I don't know that I would say he's depressed. I don't know that I'd say Job's depressed. I would say that their distress at those times is being kind of manifest as what we would a lot of times describe as depressive symptomatology, or at least a reduced mood, significantly reduced mood. So I think when we're not, I heard someone say one time, the Bible invites lament. It doesn't call for its suppression. So I think the way to, when we're dealing with somebody who has, dealing with these kind of feelings, these kind of thoughts, I think the last thing we want to do is go, oh, well, you're just a bad Christian. And if you were a better Christian, you wouldn't have these. And it's easy for someone who isn't depressed to say that, perhaps. I think for families, what I would recommend is that, listen to the person who's depressed. Don't try to over-spiritualize, what they're feeling, what they're saying, and don't rush to try to fix them. You just want to be present. You want to be an outlet for them to express the feelings they're having. And some of the things you may hear are not very pleasant. I think you need to be aware of early signs. You want to watch for the appetite issues or the sleeping or the functionality, the person starting to struggle, problems getting up and getting to work, or whatever it may be. And I think you want to encourage them and support them, and I think you want to be a conduit to them getting to professional care as well. Here at the Hope and Healing Center, we use an integrated approach to care where faith is integrated into the treatments that we use. And there certainly are lots of people out there that offer those kind of integrated approaches to care. If you have some of those by you, I think those are wonderful. I also think that if you don't have those by you and you do have quality mental health care providers that provide with evidence-based treatments, then I don't see any reason that a Christian shouldn't go and get the treatment they need. A lot of times I find, and you might have something to say about this as well, Maddie, a lot of times I find that Christians particularly, are very adamant about having a Christian therapist that, integrates care, faith into the care. But, they go to a doctor and they don't know what their doctor's faith is. They go to a dentist, they don't know what their dentist's faith is. If they had cancer, they just want the best cancer surgeon or cancer oncologist that they can find. And again, I don't have any problem with any of those. I just think that, God provides a lot of expertise out there in the world for us to choose from. And I think there are people that are affirming of faith and there are people who aren't affirming of faith. And so I think we always should go to people who are affirming of our faith. I don't think a Christian has to go to somebody who uses an integrated approach to care. I prefer an integrated approach to care, and I've worked for years to develop that. But I think you need to go to the best provider that you have access to that's going to be able to help you with that. I also think the church has a role to play in supporting individuals and being kind of the anchor for their recovery and for their faith.
And while it can be a challenge, if you're the person who's experiencing depression or feeling depressed, it can be a challenge to really hear what people might be saying to you, because that's part of the symptoms of the issue with depression. But I would say do your best. If you're listening to this and you're feeling like maybe I'm depressed, maybe I'm that person that needs some support, if you have safe people around you, if you have people that you trust, do your best to listen to them. If they're coming and saying, I'm happy to get you connected, maybe try this support group. Like, do you think maybe you should be talking to someone? It's easy for us to say, no, I should be stronger than that. Like, I should just be able to pray and feel fine. But if you have people around you, encouraging you, don't dismiss it, really try to lean into those supportive people if they are safe, and they are people that you trust, because sometimes the depression can be so insidious. You don't just wake up. Most people don't just wake up fine one day, then wake up extremely depressed the next day, because it's this insidious, progressive, display of symptoms, and other people will notice it. And when you're the one experiencing it, you may not realize the changes. So if you have people that are willing to come to you and say, hey, I notice this is what's going on, like you've changed, maybe you're a little more moody and, we're worried about you. Try to take it as an act of love, even though it can be a little, upsetting or disheartening to have someone say that. But if you've got safe people around you, they're probably coming at you with in the love intention.
Much easier to see it from the outside when you're talking about moods and things like that. Because like you said, we're always just trying to get through, personally. And really, what Maddie and I want to impress on you out there that are listening is that there is absolutely no shame in going to a mental health care provider. I don't care what anyone's ever told you. A mental health care provider is a provider like any other provider. You have a sore throat, you go to a physician and try to figure out why you have a sore throat. If your belly hurts, you go try to figure out why your belly hurts. If you have a depressed mood and you do not understand why you have a depressed mood, if you are struggling to function because you are so down, there is a brain in your head. It is an organ. It cannot function correctly sometimes. And so, and circumstances can affect that. So there's no reason to be shamed by going and having a professional take a look at what's going on with you and then give you some suggestion. Just because you go to a mental health care provider doesn't mean you have to go to a mental health care provider every day for the rest of your life. just like when the doctor gives you antibiotics for your strep throat, hopefully you'll just take them for 10 days and you won't have to take them anymore. So,
Right.
Imagine if you went to the provider and you said, I don't know what's going on with me. I'm just really down. And they assessed you and they said, hey, well, you know what? I think you're just really stressed out. I don't think you really meet criteria for depression. Let's talk a little bit about how you might reduce stress in your life. Wouldn't you rather know that than you do meet criteria for depression? And if you did meet criteria of depression, wouldn't you want to know that and know that there are effective treatments for you to be able to be treated for that and to move forward?
Oftentimes just reaching out to someone is so helpful. We'll have people come in and they probably don't meet the criteria for a depression diagnosis, but life has become extremely stressful for them. And so they're feeling some of these symptoms and they'll come in and we'll talk and then they'll say, yeah, thanks, this was really helpful. And they kind of go, I'm like feeling better just saying it out loud. And then we'll go, okay, well, do you want to talk about, therapy, what that looks like, blah, blah, blah. And they reach out a week later and they're saying, I actually am feeling so much better now. I think I just needed, like they hadn't said anything out loud to anyone. Like maybe they didn't have someone or didn't feel safe or just felt ashamed of it, which, we want to encourage people to get to support. But so calling a therapist can be so helpful because like you said, you might realize I don't have depression. I just needed a little bit more support, or I do, and here are the steps that I can take to care for myself.
And a lot of times you see that same thing with if someone isn't interested or able or willing to go to a therapist, they go to a support group. And
Right.
I know you've seen, just like I've seen, people are like, oh my gosh, this has been fantastic. I've gone to 3 sessions of the support group. This is what I've always needed. I just needed an outlet. I just needed to hear what other people were struggling with. And there's lots of great depression-oriented or mental health-oriented support groups out there, and many of which are faith-based. And so, so there's that, at another level to go and talk to your pastor or a lay counselor, or just to sit down and begin the process of kind of working towards this. So, I think a lot of times you just have to kind of overcome the shame and the guilt associated with feeling like maybe we're not getting it done on our own. So maybe it might be worthwhile a little bit for us to talk about some of the treatments. I think that, most people think of treatment for depression as antidepressants. So you take antidepressant medication, of which there are a large number. So the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors like Prozac, Lexapro, and any number of other ones. Those are kind of your common first line for pharmacological treatment of depression, but they're also used for treatment of anxiety. Zoloft is a antidepressant that's used oftentimes for the treatment of anxiety issues because you're really looking at kind of similar systems in the brain. But one of the things I want to say to people is I hear a lot of people say, well, yeah, but I don't want to take medication. And that's the reason that they use for not wanting to go to somebody. And so what I would say is there are pharmacological treatments for depression, and there are psychotherapeutic or talking therapy treatments for depression. And it's more important that you get some treatment for your depression than to do nothing. And sometimes people take medication and sometimes they don't. But depression can be treated just with psychotherapeutic intervention. And here at the Hope and Healing Center, we use cognitive behavioral therapy, which is kind of I would say the most evidence-based kind of gold standard treatment for depression. There are other treatments, but it's kind of what I would think is the most clear evidence for its effectiveness. It's a process.
Yeah. Well, and everyone who comes into the clinic here for therapy, they're screened and we determine whether they need to see a psychiatrist here or if they have one out in the community. But the reality is you can go to a psychiatrist, and a psychiatrist is the prescribing provider for psychotropic medication. And the psychiatrist or the doctor might say, yes, it sounds like you're struggling with some depression, like an antidepressant might be helpful. And you can say, I don't know. I think I want to think about it. Or, no, I don't want to do that. Let's talk about other options. So I think a lot of people are worried because they don't want to be on medicine. So they just don't even, they say, I don't want to be on an antidepressant. I don't want to do that. So they don't go to the doctor. When in reality, you might get different information from the doctor. They're like, well, you're not struggling with depression. It's anxiety. So let's talk about that. And so you have the right to say no. Just because you go see a doctor doesn't mean they can force treatment on you. So this is the same as seeing any other sort of doctor. And I try to remind people that because they won't even go. And I go, just go get information. It's just educational for you at this point. I mean, I understand that.
Yeah. It's important for people to know there's more than medicine. I mean, I think medication can be wonderfully effective. I think for the right person in the right circumstances, some people aren't going to be, it's not going to work with them. And other people are so nervous about taking it that it could be a bad thing if they take it because it could, put them in a worse state of mind. But I think that medication is one aspect of treatment. I think, like I said, psychotherapeutic interventions, talking therapy, support, I think is another leg of the stool of treatment. And that is, I think it's very important that you have effective support around you, supportive family, friends, a supportive faith community, people that can help you kind of fill in the gaps as you're recovering. That's tremendously important. And so I think, there's a lot of things that, lifestyle changes. I think that's another thing, eating healthy, exercise. So there's a lot of things that can be done that aren't medication that are tremendously therapeutic. But I think the most important thing to do is to do something, not to say, well, I don't want to take medication. So as you said, I just don't go do anything. Then I just kind of stay home.
This is one of the things that I tell a lot of my clients that have depression is that, one of the symptoms is a loss of motivation, right? Like like just getting to session was the hardest thing. Maybe they haven't even showered, they haven't done anything. So they say, I just don't feel like doing it. I don't feel motivated. Like I just want to lay down. I just want to stay in bed. I don't want to get up. I don't have any motivation. That's what I hear. And I understand that. It's very much a symptom.
Right.
And you don't have to have motivation to do something.
Right.
Doesn't make doing it any easier. I realize that. I go, but you do not have to have motivation to get up and shower. You have to get up and shower.
That's exactly right.
And I'm making it's easier said than done, right? And I try to remind people, like, if you're depressed and you're waiting for motivation to come, like, you're not working with yourself towards the healing kind of process. Just, make a decision, get up and do something, even if it's just small, if it's just changing your clothes. Like, you don't have to have the motivation to do that. You have to get up and change your clothes, like one foot in front of the other, for small little things. And then it builds and it grows into being able to get back into the swing of life and find productivity again.
Yeah, it doesn't have to feel good. I think that's the thing. The other thing, and there's a when you're talking about mental health problems, you're talking months to years. You're not talking days to weeks. I mean, it's going to take time to get out of this. And your motivation is, I'm not where I want to be. That's the motivation. I mean, I don't know what that even has a feeling associated with it. I'm not where I want to be. I can't. It's hard for me to get up out of bed in the morning. I've been late to work. Whatever. That's not where I want to be. Okay, that's it. There doesn't have to be a feeling. I think a lot of times it's a feeling, like it's almost, it's very similar to like, and this is one, this is just, I laugh because this is something I've been doing. I really need to work out, but I have no motivation. And so, and like you just said, you don't need motivation. You just need to do it.
Just do it.
Okay, I don't want to go work out. I don't like it when I work out, but I know intellectually that I need to do that to be healthy. So you just go and you just do it, and it stinks and you don't like it and it doesn't feel good, but I know that it's necessary. And that's the same thing. That's when and I know, again, like you just said, that's easy for us to say that, but once you begin to develop that relationship with your counselor or therapist, they're going to be there to kind of help walk you through that, to kind of give you ways to quote unquote motivate yourself, or goals that you can meet and make, so that'll be built into your therapeutic intervention. And, but now you have an advocate, you have someone to walk along with you through this. It's much easier to walk along with somebody than it is to try to do it yourself. It's not something you're going to be able to think your way out of on your own. It might relent over time. Depressive episodes do, but there's no reason to suffer. And there's no guarantee how long that could be or how deep the depression could get or what that might look like. And it's not because you one day decided to eat asparagus and you thought the right way about the Psalms or something. It just kind of, your brain kind of got back to where it needed to be. But, one of the other things that you're learning in therapy is to watch for early warning signs and triggers. You're learning to come up with, to learn skills and techniques so that you can manage stress and deal with symptomatology when it starts to appear. So therapy is kind of teaching you to try to be a little bit more in control of this, and in a really very much so in a preventative way, I would say. I mean, not in the classic sense of preventative way, but in a way in which you could say, hey, you know what? I had a depressive episode a few years ago. I got some treatment for it. Haven't had it in a few years, but I'm starting to notice some, like when you mentioned earlier, Maddie, a lot of times you don't notice, but if you've gone through therapy and you've learned about your illness, you may notice, and you could catch it even earlier than waiting for someone outside to recognize it and say, hey, well, it's time for me to go back and see my therapist again.
Right.
Or maybe I do need to start back on medication or whatever. And so there's a real preventative aspect to treatment as well that I think a lot of people don't realize. And also it educates you to just kind of be able to understand what's going on with you in a real meaningful way so that you don't have the shame and guilt that society throws all over you.
Yeah, and experiencing depression or feeling down there's nothing to be ashamed of. It doesn't make you weak. I mean, all of the things that, unfortunately, when you're feeling depressed, your brain tells you are true is not actually accurate. And getting to support. Oftentimes, some of the thoughts that we have when we're feeling depressed are hard to say out loud to people that are in our lives because they can be so dark. So just getting into a space with a therapist or a support group or, whatever that may look like, to have a space to say those things and kind of process what's happening internally with you through the depression is really, really meaningful because sometimes even just getting it out can be helpful. And so reach out, ask for support. Once you get into the process of therapy and understanding what your depression looks like, and like you were saying, the cycles and triggers can really help in a proactive way and prevent issues in the future or help you kind of address it before it becomes too overwhelming in future dates. You can communicate that with loved ones and family members so they can be on the lookout as well. I mean, there's just so many benefits to being aware of what's going on with your depression or your mental health issue in general and being able to navigate and manage that. Like someone with diabetes doesn't go, I know I have diabetes and something happens when I eat something or it goes up or down. I can't fully remember and I'm supposed to do something, right? Like there's a process that people go through to manage their diabetes. And if you have depression, you have to unfortunately go through and figure that out and then be diagnosed and figure out how to manage it. So it really is another medical issue that just takes management, as unfortunate as any medical issue is.
Right. We have a lot of great resources here at the Hope and Healing Center related to depression. So just wanted to name off a couple, and we'll make sure that those are put in the notes so that you can find them. So I've written several books, many of which have chapters on depression or more broadly talk about mental health related things for you that may be struggling or may have a family member or a friend, or you may be a clergy member that helps others. So Grace for the Afflicted is a book about adult mental health problems. And there's a whole chapter on depression in there. It talks about kind of a clinical and biblical perspective on mental health issues. Grace for the Children is a book on disorders in adolescents and children. It also discusses depression in there. I wrote a book called Madness and Grace most recently, which is a very practical guide on how to work with people who have serious mental health problems, what to watch for, how to refer them, how to get them to care. So that's another one you might look at. So we'll put those links. And then we provide a whole lot of training here at the Hope and Healing Center through our Gateway to Hope University. If you're interested in learning more about how you might work with people that have mental health problems, or you might learn how to recognize someone and then be able to help them find care. So we'll put the link down there and that. And then finally, if you need to talk to somebody, we have our Hope Line, which is a 365 days a week support line, 5 to 8 p.m. every evening. That's Central Time, 5 to 8 p.m. Central Time, answered in English and Spanish. And you could talk to one of our trained mental health coaches, provide you a half-hour counseling on the phone and help you find mental health care providers. And it's a support line, so you can call as many times as you want just to talk to somebody. And sometimes that's just the beginning. It's just to talk to somebody and kind of start the process. So we'll make sure that there are information and links about all of those in the notes below.
Well, thank you all for joining us again this week on Madness and Grace. If you've got questions, shoot them our way via the email. Otherwise, we look forward to seeing you at our next episode. Thanks for joining our conversation on this episode of the Madness and Grace podcast. If you found value in our discussion today, we'd love it if you'd subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts so you never miss an episode.
And if you enjoyed what you heard, please consider leaving us a rating and review. It helps others find these important conversations.
Sharing this podcast with friends and family members is also a wonderful way to extend hope to those who might be struggling with mental health concerns.
We'll be back next time with another candid conversation about madness and grace. See you then.